Hi, and welcome to Nexus Education MakerEd series with Caroline Keep. I'm here today with Dan Lynch from OggCamp. Also one of the oldest, one of the oldest open source events in the UK, I'd probably say.
It's not one of the oldest. It is one of the biggest, though.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah, we inherited. Hello, everyone. By the way, we inherited the mantle from another show called Lug Radio Live, which was another podcast they used to. They started in doing events, I think, in about 2004, maybe.
Yeah.
Or 5. No, maybe 2005. Anyway, we did. Yeah, that would make sense. And we started in 2009, so we're 10 years old this year.
10 years old. Also one of the organisers for my event, Liverpool Makefest. So apologies, guys, if you've missed my absence recently. I've been organising the UK's now biggest tech making event.
Is that one of the oldest?
No, it's not. We're only 5. But Dan is effectively one of our bosses on Makefest as well. So he works on both events. And I thought today might be good to take an opportunity to talk about open source in education. Okay. Seeing as you're a big FOSS advocate, you can find Dan on things like FOSS Weekly on Twitch
Floss
TV.
Weekly. You may remember me from such podcasts so I used to do the most famous one would be a thing called Linux Outlaws. I used to do back in the day. That started in 2007, so that was fairly old, and that ran for 7 years. We did 370 episodes. And it was massive at one time. It was like, tens of thousands or 50,000 or something downloads a week. It was pretty popular. So anyway, I somehow looked into people actually listened to what I had to say, which was interesting. I never thought anyone would listen to it. And then actually, as we went along, the people that we used to talk about would send emails going, "Oh, you said this." And I was like, shit, well... actually,
you're all right. It's
I went, shh. I was like, wow, they're actually listening to it, so that was nice. But these days, if you you can see this ugly mug on Floss Weekly on the Twit network, which is an American podcasting network, or netcasting network as they like to call it.
There's a whole bunch of stuff on there that's talking about open source, isn't there? Open source
so
apps
Floss is just one show, and there's about 30 or 40 shows on Floss, on Twit, but they're not all about open source. I think ours is the only one that's explicitly about free and open source software. We are Floss Weekly.
So how do you see open source being? What's the state of open source? Because obviously for us in MakerEd, open source is a big part of the ethos of Maker education, of hands-on technology. It's teaching people how to build the things and how to run the classes and how to do it. We share most things freely and openly. So what do you think, like, open source, how has it changed over the years now?
Wow. Well, I mean, I think it's a lot more accessible now. When I started with Linux and free and open source software in about 2002, 2000, getting towards 2003, but 2002. When a friend of mine at university, I was at uni at the time, and one of the other guys there was doing his dissertation on Linux and how comparable it was to Windows and things like that. And he gave me a CD, basically, with it on. It was on a magazine cover. And I took it home and tried it out. And at that time, it was really hard to kind of get most things working. So unfortunately, you wouldn't have the experience that you have today, where most things, we're recording this on a Linux computer. Most people have had the experience of using things like Chromebooks, which run on Linux, Android phones run a Linux kernel, and there's Ubuntu and lots of things that people will have used and found fairly easy to use. Back in those days, you couldn't get your video working, you couldn't get it was a bit of an effort. But it's really got a lot easier, and it's nice to see it more accessible. I think what's happened in the big changes have been changes in attitudes of companies, actually.
Yeah.
So Microsoft being a big example, obviously, I mean, everyone's heard of them through Windows and Office and all these other things. They had a really, really staunch kind of anti-open source model, if you like. Their leadership at the time was different to what it is now. Their CEO changed and all that sort of stuff. But his kind of philosophy was that he had to eradicate Linux, and it was he actually said that Linux was a cancer. Wow. And it was going to eat all of
their attitudes changed since then.
Software. So a big change now is, many of you, if you've worked with Microsoft, they do a lot of educational stuff. They always have. They've always been very good at that in getting into schools. They've got a much more open kind of attitude to things now, and they collaborate on lots of things now, which they never used to do. I'm still not going to say they're my best friend, but they're certainly a lot better than they used to be. But now it's kind of like the argument, I think in a lot of ways, the argument left them behind, because they were still, say 10 years ago, they were still clinging to the whole, you must do it this way, our way is the best. And meanwhile, like the web, for example, was all built on things like PHP and Python and MySQL as database servers and stuff. Everyone's heard of, like, you may have heard of the term LAMP servers, which is Linux, Apache, MySQL, tested myself, MySQL, PHP. And that's became like what, like Facebook was built on.
Pretty much.
And things like that. So they kind of lost that argument because it just already took over. And it's great that now it's more accessible and more people can do it. I don't know what it's like in schools now.
Because we have this thing where a lot of the things that we're being offered now is very, open source. A lot of the big foundations that I absolutely love and support, things like Raspberry Pi and MakerEd, a lot of them are built on open source. The Pi Foundation, the Python Foundation.
Well, Python, is an open source language.
As open source project. A lot of the stuff that is being given out to schools, but I have some. A lot of us, there's two kind of streams to this thing. One, a lot of us were asked to develop educational resources left, right and centre for open source, and now I'm seeing a decline in the amount of people that are being not taking up doing this for free. They used to do it a lot of the time for free, but now I think a lot of us are kind of shying away from that.
So that brings up a good point, actually. Sorry, I cut you off.
Because for teachers, you guys are going to get asked to do this.
Yeah, so there's a big difference between, just because something is open source doesn't mean that it has to be free, as in beer. It's what we say. So no money exchanges hands, and it doesn't mean you have to work on it for free. And not get paid, because loads of people work on huge projects. Things like Microsoft, for example, I keep going back to them, but they've, in the last couple of years, 3-4 years, whatever it is, started to employ 100 of the top open source developers to work on their projects. But although they technically work for Microsoft, so for example, working on things like, the creator of Python, Guido van Rossum, he works for Google. But he spends, I forget how much of his time, it's at least 50%, it might be more. He is paid by Google to just work on Python. They don't tell him what to work on.
But he
just runs Python because it's so important to them. And there's many other people who are there as well, like Samba, Jeremy Allison, who does the Samba project, who name dropping is a friend of mine. He does Samba, and he works in a similar way. I'm sure he does stuff for Google at certain times, but the rest of the time he can just work on Samba. So you can get paid for it. You don't necessarily have to be...
I think that's an important message for teachers. I think quite often we get asked to develop educational content or resources that are then, they're going to be open source to every educator in the country, and we're going to put them on the website. And then it's the question about, what do you charge for that or not charge for that, or should you be charging for your time?
It's complicated. It depends. So the other thing is that a lot of people find confusing, and I really don't blame them, is the amount of different licenses that there are. There are literally
and I think that probably is a good one to cover, because you're quite the license geek, about exactly which licenses you can put your stuff under. So, we all know as teachers, everybody's seen some of the dodgy things going on with the resources, where you're putting resources up for free for other teachers to use, and they're being then developed or taken by corporations or companies. So there's some things you can do to make sure when you develop resources that you keep hold of them. So give us the rundown of the level of licensing, the top 5 licensing.
Top 5. Okay, so it depends. Firstly, it depends what you're talking about. So many of the open source, free and open source licenses that we know were developed specifically for software. So when it comes to content, they're not necessarily the best things to use. So ones that people will have heard of. So the top one for me would be the GNU public license, the GNU general public license, or the GNU GPL for short, is what say the Linux kernel, which is the heart of the system there, is under, and many other things. So we won't get into versions, because there's different versions of the license. Version 2 is the version that's under. You'll probably have heard of that. So that's what's referred to as a copyleft license. So the big thing to remember with licenses is there's really 2 big distinctions when it comes to sharing licenses or things like that is between what they call copyleft licenses and permissive licenses. And you may have even heard people use these terms. They don't always explain them. So basically, a copyleft license, something like the GPL, is something that that uses the same legal copyright framework that we use to enforce things like copyright and to, say, bring a case against someone for, copying something that you've done that you own a copyright on. It uses that. It was a very clever thing that they came up with in the mid to late 80s. They came up with this idea of using that law and turning it on itself, so you can use the same thing to enforce sharing of stuff. Mm-hmm. So a copyleft license is exactly what it means. It turns copyright on its head and forces people to share what they do. So if I write a program, piece of code or something, or I create something, because you can get, I'll talk about them in a sec, but you can get content licenses. Well, I create something, put it under a copyleft license, you come along and find it and decide to do something with it. Mm-hmm. You're actually required legally by the license to, if you change it or you modify it or you, in any way, or you improve it or whatever you do to it, you're legally bound to share what you've done back with me. Mm-hmm. So that's the idea. So it means that although we're sharing stuff, you can't take what I've done and run away with it and basically lock it up, which is where permissive licenses come in. They're ones like the biggest kind of proponents of these are people like Apple, for obvious reasons. They use a lot of things like the MIT license, which is popular, and the BSD license, and they're both what's known as permissive licenses. And under a permissive license, you only need to give credit to the original person for the fact that you got something from them. So in that scenario of me and you again, you could take my thing and build it into a massive multi-million-pound product and change it. And all you need to do is go, thanks, Dan. Yeah. You don't need to give me any money. You don't need to do anything other than keep my name somewhere on the code, in the code or on the license document. And that's what's known as a permissive license. Now, you may think to yourself, why the hell would anybody use a permissive license if that's the case? Yeah. And the big argument for a lot of people who promote permissive licenses is that they encourage adoption. So a lot of people were scared of copyleft licenses. Some people still are. And the argument is that big companies or whatever, say Apple or Google or someone, isn't going to take my project and use it. Or back in the day, that's what they used to say. They wouldn't, people wouldn't adopt my code or build it because they were scared of this copyleft element. And to some degrees that could be true. But actually what's happened now, which is really nice, is that although Google, for example, promote a thing called the Apache license, which is yet another permissive license, really popular, for things like Android, you'll have heard of, that's under Apache license, that's a permissive license. And other things, they do use a hell of a lot of GPL copyleft code. And in terms of content, which is probably what you're thinking of, there are things like Creative Commons, which a lot of people struggle to understand.
I think when you go through tests, if you go through the test process, if you're the average teacher, you go through tests and you decide to share some content with them, or you share some on another educational website. Most of us use tests, we know it, and it says in that second bracket, what do you license it's under? And most of us will talk to that where we say share, and it'll say Creative Commons. But what does that mean for the average teacher?
Well, look, so again, the problem is that the Creative Commons itself is not a license. It's a body that create licenses and give them out. And there are more than one Creative Commons license. So the thing with Creative Commons, which is really nice, is they have clauses, they call them, which are like things that you have to abide by. You can mix and change and stuff. So they have, going back to the thing I talked about before about permissive and copyleft and all that, you can bring those elements and choose how you want to use them in the license. So the really common one that people use, that I use a lot, is the SA, which is share alike. So if you look at a Creative Commons license, it can look really confusing because it'll have CC, like by, SA, NC, for example, and that sounds really confusing. But what it means is the by bit means attribution. So like the permissive thing, you have to put my name on it, or you have to keep my name on it if you use something. The SA bit is like the copyleft element, which is you have to share it alike, share alike. That's what it's called. And then the NC in this case would be non-commercial. So you can actually restrict people from selling what you've done. And the thing with the Creative Commons is you can mix and match and take those away. So you see things that are like CC by or CC SA and CC. They always have by in there for the attribution, but they'll mix and match them. So the really confusing thing for people often can be, how do I know which license to choose? And the really good thing to know is that if you go to creativecommons.org or just search for Creative Commons, it'll come up and find the official website. They have a licensing tool on there, and you go through it. It's really quick. It's just like a few check boxes, and you choose like you put in your name of the thing that you're doing, and maybe a little description. It's just a little text box, and then it has options for what you want people to be able to do with it. So you can say, I want people to put my name on it. So you tick that, and then you say, I want people to. You can say, do you want people to share changes with you? And you can say yes or no. And do you allow commercial uses? And then you just decide there, tick through them, what you want or don't want. And at the end, it spits out the license for you with an image file that you can stick on as your license, like badge, if you like. Yeah. And a link as well to the license.
I think there's several bits with MakerEd, isn't there? There's those of us who really want to share everything that we do resource-wise, but then there's those of us who do want to restrict those resources down to things that are, in the interest of teaching, so non-commercial efforts. And I mean, quite often I've seen, very big MakerEd courses, very expensive, that are extracurricular or outreach, using lots of people's open projects.
So in that case, it depends what license they put it under, and maybe they didn't even know what license they were submitting it under. But if it comes to the fact that if you discover that this content that's in this course that people are selling was originally put out under even a share-alike license, requires people to share it under the same terms they received it, so for free essentially, or a non-commercial license, they are actually breaking copyright. And you can ask, it's same as if you put it under, a really restrictive ultimate copyright license. You have the same right to say to them, you can't do that.
Yeah. I mean, the question is how do teachers, that's a great tip there for us to go and look at Creative Commons. I'm a big fan of Creative Commons.
There's lots of examples on there as well of how people have
challenged it
which is really
used
useful.
Yeah, so you can kind of protect that kind of content that's online. We've got that kind of protection element, but we've also got how can the open source community works with education. So there's loads of examples of the open source community coming together to work with education on various projects. What bits can you do that are in open source out there?
So one of the big things I always promote to students, I particularly people who are wanting to get into development software stuff for a living, but it can be for other things as well, is that I always say to them, who makes Windows? And they'll say like, well, Microsoft make Windows. And I go, yeah, okay, but who wrote it and who writes these bits? And then they might say Bill Gates, which is not necessarily true these days, but they might say Bill Gates. But anyway, the point is, as we get in there and we talk about Apple and stuff, they realize that they don't know anybody who's done any of the stuff. And I'm like, so why don't you know who they are? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I said, it's because they work for a company where all of their work is put out under the company's license, and they're like faceless workers in a thing. If you really want to be recognized as an expert in your field, it's like the scientific field. You have to do it. It's like scientific method and all that. You have to publish your stuff openly, and people know who you are. So if you work in, say, open source or free software, and you get to, like I mentioned a couple of names there, like everybody knows. You can Google who created Python. You can Google who created other things, and you can find out all the people who. So if anybody who's committed to it, submitted stuff for it that's gone in, it's all publicly listed. So if you want to build up a portfolio and say, I want to be recognised for something particularly, or I want to be a rock star program, or whatever you want to call it, which is not necessarily a great term for it. There really is only one way to go, which is to be like an open source developer, in my view. That's what I always pitch to people. So
what would be some of the great open source projects that you've seen in education?
In education, sorry.
In themselves as well?
In themselves. So I think, well, I'll come back to it, but I do think, I'll come back to this point in a second, but I do think we could do more in open source to bridge the gap with education.
I think we could.
I think that needs work. But so there are some great open source tools that people use. So some of you may be familiar with Moodle.
Yeah.
For building your online VLE, is it? This is where VLEs and stuff, as they call them.
Moodle's one.
Yeah, so Moodle's quite a big one. Moodle's an open source project. And it's created.
I wonder sometimes whether teachers realise that Moodle's an open source project. I think sometimes we miss the point about what actually is open source or what actually isn't. So, those kind of projects are good to support. Because also, quite often, open source projects don't have licensing fees with them.
No.
So, if you're paying a license to a school for a particular product, quite often there's an open source alternative that you could be using that's completely transparent and license free.
Yeah, and there are even, you'd have to search for it now because I can't remember the exact URL or link for it, but there's a site called Open Source Alternatives where you can go on and type in, whatever it might be, I don't know, Photoshop or something.
Yeah.
And it will then list you all of the alternatives that it knows of that are open source, and then you can try them if you want. Now, who's to say whether they're as good or not? I mean, I think a lot of them are, but you would go through and find them. But there's a few.
We've got things like LibreOffice, haven't we?
LibreOffice
That is
massive,
probably the massive one.
That
I mean, anybody
one.
who's using Raspberry Pi in education will notice that the whole thing is pretty much built on open source software.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And LibreOffice happens to be one of them, and that is the alternative to really Microsoft Office in that sense.
It is, and you've got
free.
And the Document Foundation, which is part of. Well, it's all quite convoluted, but the LibreOffice kind of movement, which was OpenOffice, many people have heard of OpenOffice. It rebranded as LibreOffice. There was some splits between various people, but anyway, LibreOffice is the current one which people use, and they're also linked to the Document Foundation, and their kind of goal is to have one global document format that works in every piece of software, be it like proprietary or open source or whatever. So they have a thing called ODF, which is the Open Document Format. Which does work in Microsoft Office now, although I'm not sure how well it works, but it does work. And they also all this interoperability, because as an end user, somebody who just wants to get their work done, you don't want to have to worry about whether your file will open in. I send you a document, I want to know that you can open it. I just don't want to have to think about it, and that's one of the great things. So the Open Document Foundation. They're doing, the Document Foundation. They're doing stuff with that, and I believe they do some educational stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of being open source and using open source software are kind of two separate things. I mean, MakerEd itself has its roots in open source.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Categorically from the old school maker spaces and hacker spaces, and the sheer amount of old school makers who have a hand in the open source movements to start with. So a lot of them are built on this idea that there should be an open, free transmission of information between people.
Exactly, yeah.
But I feel like quite often we've seen the adoption of that information over time where, especially for those teachers, especially creating educational content for you guys, that are just being kind of adopted, sucked into the corporate proprietary end of it. So there is, if you are starting to create resources and you're starting to look at technology and you're starting to think, make a couple of MakerEd lessons, making sure you've got your head around licensing is a really important thing, because you want to be able to make sure that what you create is credited to you and also isn't used to the detriment of every other school maker space later on when they go, can we sell this to you? I think it's crucially important, and that leads to our idea of credit in maker spaces, so you can get our joint home does have a lot to do with maker spaces, a lot to do with the maker community itself. And we quite often, I think for us, there's a big part of making is to credit the people who are making things, whether they be students, staff, or anybody else. It's what you work on, you credit. How important do you think that actually is to our community? I mean, I'm interested because I know how important it is to me.
It's massive. I mean, it's massively important. And you mentioned that MakerEd and just the maker movement in general is kind of based in open source, or it comes from that ethos. It's exactly the same thing. I mean, people, I think in Makerspace particularly, I mean, it's about sharing ideas, isn't it? I mean, I don't think any of us get any better or smarter or whatever by hiding in a corner and trying to keep everything we do away or not. You need help from people. So the great thing about something like Makerspaces that I've experienced is being able to go in, because I often don't know what the hell I'm doing, I'll be honest, go in and be able to say, I don't know what I'm doing wrong with this, or I can't get this thing to work, or whatever it might be. And then somebody will come along more often than not and go, well, what are you trying to do? And here's how you do it. Or if they don't know, they'll know someone who knows. And vice versa. I might know something that they don't know. So one of the great things I've seen particularly in Does Liverpool, that's the one that I have experience of. I don't know how unique it is in that, but you get a lot of cross-pollination, I like to call it, which is where we've got people coming in now who are making little amplifiers and stuff like SoundKit. And they've then got to work with some of the artists and the others who were then doing stuff with, like, they want to mix it in with, what if we could mix that and put a sensor on it and do this? And it's really nice to see people kind of mixing of the art and the kind of engineering stuff and all of it kind of building into one big melting pot. And I think that's so important.
But I think that level of merge you get with students in school-led maker spaces if you encourage it. But I think we do have this thing where we quite often have to take it quite seriously, the crediting process, crediting people for the work that they do. So I think there's several examples. I spoke this week about Bailey's prosthetic hand project from the Enable project. So that's a really great open source project. It's the 3D printed prosthetic hand project from the Enable project themselves, and they did 3D printed hand projects for schools, and people could print a hand to help children who didn't have hands. And Bailey was one of the children that was up at Does Liverpool about 5 years ago doing this project. And I've seen a massive increase of, and I'd put it out on my LinkedIn, of people putting out stuff to do with, here's some of our resources on our prosthetic project. And it was kind of like, well, that originally comes from an open source. I think quite often there's not, especially for general world teachers, very techie teachers will probably know of how predominant open source software is to us and how much we use on a regular basis.
I was going to say, you probably use it every day, whether you know it or not. I mean, everybody who's got an Android phone out there, if you've ever used an Android phone or tablet, you've used open source software. I mean, now a big thing is, which has grown massively over the years, is that engineers and device makers, people who make things like microwaves and things like that, and particularly things like now you've got home heating systems that have like sensors in them and stuff. More often than not, they'll run on some version of Linux, or they'll have open source components in them. Things like the PlayStation, your TV, it's probably everywhere in your car. There's a big car project.
And I think for us as educators, when we look at software and we're trying to make judgments about what to use with our students or what to engage with, I think there's often that fear of it being open source somehow makes it somewhat dangerous. When actually I don't.
Yeah, I'm probably not doing a lot for that image with my cowboy hat.
But it really doesn't, because because it's open source, the transparency is there. So for us, for things like, and I'll talk more about this in the next couple of seasons, the things like data privacy, where our students' information is going, what actually the app is collecting or what a program is collecting on our student, where that student data is going. If it's an open source app or open source project, then you can see and interrogate that and look exactly what's happening to it. If it's proprietary, nobody has any idea what's going on with that. Once it's gone from you, it's gone. And there's no telling where it goes. Things like Classroom Dojo is a perfect example. The Children's Commission has come out and been quite critical of them in their current report called What They Know About Me. That data is then dished out to 35 other companies that we have no idea how it's being used from then on. So when we see software or projects and we're trying to judge what kind of apps or what kind of things we're going to use in our classroom, what video one, what cartoon making one, what software we're going to use to do this storyboard project, or how we're going to use that, what we want to be looking at is, if it's free, why is it free? Because if it's free and it's an open source project, it'll be really easy to tell because they'll be very transparent. But if it's free and it doesn't seem to be an open source project, then it means that somewhere in there is data capture. And that is, deep questions for us from data protection points of view.
Yeah, and it's important to remember as well that although it can get confusing when people talk about free and open source software and all the rest of it, not just because something is free and you don't pay for it, so it's free as in monetary terms, does not mean it's open source in any way. No. You need to check, and to use a well-trodden catchphrase, I suppose, a well-trodden thing that a lot of people say, no such thing as a free lunch, really. You know, I mean, if you're not sure what if you're getting something for free and it's not open source and you don't know what's going on with it, somebody somewhere will be getting something out of it, because they wouldn't do it if unless it's an open source project where it's a community thing, or they're trying to sell you something on top, like services, for example, which is a big thing that happens in like support and whatever.
Yeah.
Then somehow they must be doing it for some reason. It's a big thing that happens a lot with social media, for example. So Facebook, all these things that you could argue that they are free. You don't pay to use them, and you can pay to advertise on them, but you don't pay to use them. So what's the value for them? Because Facebook's not a charity; they're a massive company, and so are Google, and so are all these other things, and they make money from your data. That's what they do. So if you don't know what the product is, it's probably you. Is the answer.
Yeah, it probably is. So I'm going to round up on this. Thank you, Dan, so much for talking to us. If you want to know more about open source projects and open source educational projects or the open source community overall, Dan is hosting the 10th year anniversary of OggCamp's festival in... What is it?
Sorry, that's my cue to do my pitch.
I should know this. I'm organising this.
It's my cue to do my pitch.
Go on.
So there's an event that I helped to run, which we talked about, called OggCamp, which is OggCamp. I won't explain the name now. You can look into that if you're really interested. But it's in Manchester. It's in October. It's on the 19th and 20th of October in the Pendulum Hotel, which is also the Manchester Conference Centre. It's really near Piccadilly, so very easy to get to. In Manchester. It's a 2-day event. We got some great talks coming up. We got all kinds of open hardware and software stuff going on. We've also got a kids track this year. We've got
hardware hack I'm doing.
Hardware stuff. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. Educational stuff. So something that I would like to kind of get people into, if you're watching this and you want to know more about open source, maybe you're interested in how you can use it in education or how it applies, come along and talk to us, because I'd really like to kind of build those bridges there and get more people in to talk about education as well. It's a bar camp style event, so that means you can give a talk. So if you come along, and I mean, if you're a teacher, you're going to be used to talking, aren't you? You're going to be used to giving talks in front of a group.
No, maybe not quite adults, but we're pretty used to talking.
Yeah, so you could run a session. You can just stick a post-it note up, run a 20-minute session or something where you tell people what you're doing, or you tell people what you want to do even, and you can all discuss how to make that happen. And there'll be a mixture of people who work in, and so people who work in the industry, and people who are hobbyists, and people who work in education, and it's just trying to get people together to share ideas.
Yeah, it's really good, especially if you've got any ideas. It's free,
as in beer, and free as in freedom.
It's really good if you want to, if you've got a project or something you'd really like to see happen, and maybe you don't have the technical skill for it, but you do have the educational skill for it. Do come along and just let people know what you want to see that's useful for you. We did FOSDEM a while back ago. A lot of software developers who work in open source are very eager to hear from real teachers to solve real problems for them that are useful for them in open source. So please do come along. I'll be there, and I thank you ever so much for listening. And I promise I won't leave it too late before I get organised to do the next one. Thank you, Nexus. And I'll speak to you soon.